And we now welcome Katie Childs and her panel to discuss the importance of the EU to Britain.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Katie Childs. I am the outgoing Policy and Projects Manager at the National Museum's Directors' Council and the incoming Head of Partnerships at the Imperial War Museum. Hopefully, as of the 1st of April, I'll just have one of those jobs and it'll be less confusing, well, certainly for me anyway. We wanted to do a slightly different session following from Mike's introductory talk. Which is more of a conversation and looks from three quite different perspectives about, yes, the practical implications about the decision to leave the EU, but also some of the sort of social and cultural context and the environment that led to that decision and what we do now in the future. So I'm joined by three people who have quite different, as I said, different perspectives. I'm joined by Laurie Balliol, who is a consultant and founded the Inspire EU consultancy. Gabrielle Finaldi is the director of the National Gallery, and Tony Butler is director of Derby Museums Trust. So, we're going to, as I said, have a little bit of a discussion about the kind of practical implications, but also that social and cultural context. Museums are world collections, and we are all at this conference because we think that we would like to or are running international partnerships and projects and using those collections as the basis for doing that, and feel that we can only really care for and serve our audiences, care for those collections and serve those audiences if we develop international partnerships. So we've got to consider how that might change within the context of the decision to leave the EU, but also other seismic global political events. And certainly since we kind of came up with this idea for the conference, I'm sure when we first started this, the idea of a Trump presidency seemed somewhat unlikely and a little bit fanciful. So we're living in a slightly different world than certainly when we did this conference this time last year. However, we have been set one question, which is the question on our agenda, so we thought we'd better start there. And that question is, how important do you think the EU is to your institution? So how important is the EU, Gabrielle, to the National Gallery?
Hi, good morning. Can I start with a personal anecdote? I've just come back to England from 13 years in Spain, so I've been a direct beneficiary, personally, of freedom of movement in Europe and good relations between museum institutions. Interestingly, while I was in Madrid working at the Prado, there was quite a lot of encouragement that I take Spanish nationality. I said I didn't want to take Spanish nationality because I thought that it was a tremendously useful precedent for the Prado to have a foreign national working in their institution, a precedent that they might well want to take advantage of into the future. Slightly regretting it now, because I think it will make things a bit more complicated for me into the future. But anyway, certainly for the National Gallery, it's absolutely fundamental that we keep up and develop at a time when the uncertainties that have been identified are around us, to develop ever more strongly, I think, our relations with European institutions. But I think even more broadly than that, I think it's very important for us as a museum of European art to carry on making the point that, culturally, historically, the links are extremely strong and need to be kind of brought to people's attention constantly. So I think we have a sort of broader cultural responsibility, in addition to maintaining those often bilateral relationships, whether it's with Berlin, Dusseldorf, Madrid, or Paris, which we certainly intend to do, and certainly aim to do with greater enthusiasm and greater emphasis.
So, Tony, how important is the EU to Derby Museums?
Well, again, on a personal level, the EU paid for my postgraduate fees, so I'm very grateful for them. I mean, in practical terms, it's a bit like living in Shoreditch. You're never too far away from a DJ. You're never too far away from EU funding, even if you don't get it directly. So things like the ERDF and the ESF have funded regional museums indirectly through grants to larger bodies. So I think we'll miss that, but we won't perhaps recognise it. Directly, it probably won't make that much difference to my organisation, in that we have our international partnerships have looked westwards to the States, some to Australia, and now to the Far East. So in a way, I think we took, and regional museums took the EU a bit for granted. You know, they were there, we could easily work in partnership with European organisations, and it was easy to exchange objects, we'd exchange staff. And I think perhaps sometimes we just took that for granted as being part of the furniture, and I think we're going to miss that. Last year I was in Bury. For those of you that don't know where Bury is or never been to Bury, in Greater Manchester, held the annual conference of the European Cultural Centres Network, and I can't imagine a town like Bury holding that conference outside of the EU, and I think that will be a great sadness.
And Laurie, your perspective is a little bit different. So, how important do you think the EU has been and will continue to be to those sorts of European partnerships?
So, I would like to give you a positive news in this in this difficult and challenging context, that UK is still an official member state of the EU. So there are still opportunity for you to apply. The opportunity is now. We don't know in 2 years' time what is going to be. So I encourage you to work on with your European partners on projects which are strategic for your organization, and looking maybe of taking this opportunity to speak with your partner of other mechanisms for partnership in the future. Obviously, the EU funding is a key aspect, but I mean, they will have other opportunity in the future. And the positive aspect of it is that, change could be good as well, and may help your organization to move things forward in a different way, and could encourage you to have make new ideas that you would not have thought before because of this situation. And next year is the European year for the cultural heritage. So also I encourage you maybe to think right now about something to make a voice of the cultural and creative sector, and take this opportunity really as it is now.
So, Laurie, you would agree with Mike that a period of uncertainty is also a period in which you can do things that are quite positive and think of things that may have been a little bit more radical before, but now seem like a good solution. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. You can start working differently, maybe building the relationship you already got. Is like having friends for 10 years you are working with. They will always be there for you, but it's just trying to find new ways of working. And to be honest, the EU members are not seeing, there are a bit of changing of perception, but there is a need in both sides to collaborate together, and the worry in the both sides. So I really encourage you to make this solidarity with your partner, which will be there for you.
We've touched a bit on practical implications, but is there a sort of single practical implication for the National Gallery that is either a challenge or an opportunity for you, Gabriel?
This question, I knew it was coming up. It was slightly sore for me because some of you may have read in the papers recently about a picture that we've been trying to acquire. We began the campaign to acquire it before Brexit. It was a picture that had been stopped at export, so the price on the export papers was in sterling. As we've moved on from Brexit, there's been this massive devaluation in sterling, which has meant that the owner is no longer prepared to accept the figure that appears on the export paper. So, sort of a pretty direct, I suppose, consequence of Brexit is that we've been, after a tremendously successful fundraising campaign. This was a portrait by the Florentine artist Pontormo. We don't have any in this country. We've not been able to see that through, even though we did do all the right things. So that's a very direct impact. On the question of recruitment, which Michael referred to and is absolutely central to us. What we're finding is that a lot of our expertise comes from the European mainland, as we now have begun to say. The problem for them often is not so much the uncertainty over Brexit when we talk to candidates for new jobs and so on. It's partly about the cost of living in London. Now, that's not the same throughout the country, but that's a very, very serious issue, and one that actually may be ultimately even more significant than perceived difficulties with Brexit. However, I have to say I'm completely in agreement with Laurie that this is what we have, and Michael too. We have to find opportunities. We have to push harder. We have to work harder. Look to more bilateral or trilateral relations, and develop those things that we think are so important for our institutions and for the sort of perception of culture in our country.
And certainly for an organisation as old and august as the National Gallery, you have had these partnerships for many generations of curators, if you like, for decades. And so that a political structure shouldn't necessarily be the determining factor, I guess.
No, and a lot of our institutions are very old, and we've seen some, pretty dramatic things over. And the National Gallery is nearly 200 years old. Well, we were founded out of the ashes of the Napoleonic Wars, really. So if you think of all the bits of history that we've dealt with, this is not necessarily the most dreadful that could possibly happen. Absolutely, but it's true. Partnerships are absolutely fundamental for the gallery in terms of research, in terms of linking professionals, and they must most certainly continue. Otherwise, we won't be able to continue our particular focus, which is essentially European art.
A very different sort of museum in the UK, Tony. Is it a similar concern about the kind of the impact of the uncertainty on something like the economy, or is there something else that you feel is the kind of single impact of your institution?
Well, as I said before, I think indirectly the impact on the economy would be the main thing that affects regional museums. And currently the bulk of our funding is coming through local government, and local government funding has been hugely reduced over, since austerity began in 2012, and that doesn't look as though it's going to abate. So indirectly, if the economy doesn't grow as fast as it could do, it will have a direct impact on our museums. That said, again, to be optimistic, we're taking quite a lot of interest in the work of our industries near us. So Derby has 3 very large industries based in the city. Rolls-Royce, Bombardier and Toyota all have their UK HQs there, and JCB also exist outside there. And they're taking a very different view to Brexit, looking at opportunities, and a huge company like Rolls-Royce will be modelling all sorts of scenarios, and they're a key partner in the development of our new Museum of Making. We had a meeting with the Deputy Director of JCB about 2 days after Brexit, and obviously the Chairman, Lord Banford, was a big Brexit supporter, and this guy spent an hour talking to us about all the opportunities of Brexit. So there are people out there in industry running big organisations that see nothing but opportunity from this, even if it's kind of way outside of our kind of understanding and our feelings. So people out there do think there are opportunities, and I think we as organisations ought to be running on their coattails if possible.
And Laurie, it's again your expertise, your area is European funding and the kind of funding and the partnerships that come with that. That's the sort of uncertainty of the fund. Is that the biggest impact in terms of international partnerships you can see of the decision to leave the EU, or is there something else?
Well, mainly as we all know, there is a worry about the access to EU funding, but there are already other European programs which are working currently with other other countries which are not part of the EU. So that could be an option for the future, having some kind of bilateral agreement or other way of working. There is a question mark about if UK organization will be able to lead European project, but there could be potentially some associated partner or partner of a project, which is less responsibility, less paperwork maybe, so that's a positive thing as well. There is also a question mark about obviously the EU citizen. I think is the second biggest issue in this Brexit context. So having to say that is very worried to be in the uncertainty context for EU citizen, and I had experienced that as well personally, because I used to live in the UK for 7 years, and I leave the UK one month after the Brexit for personal and professional reason, which I take as an opportunity. I took as an opportunity because I'm now based in Spain, so I gain in sunshine, but yeah, it's kind of it's kind of looking at different ways of doing things, and obviously having the flexibility to do that. And we know what it is now. We've got opportunities now to take. We don't know what will be the future, but we can, I think, working together as a key working together within the UK as partners, but also in Europe. Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about, as I said, the practicalities, but this was also quite a big social and cultural, the context in which that decision was made. This was not necessarily just a kind of an economic or a kind of practical decision of why people voted one way or the other. Tony, just to prove this, I did do some research before this. That in Derby, and I know you've talked about this quite a bit, about how it's research into 2 pieces of paper as well. But in Derby, 57% of voters, so in Derby City, voted to leave, and the turnout was 70%. And that pattern was repeated across Derbyshire. So Derbyshire Day, I found this quite surprising. 51.5% voted leave, so it's a constituency or an area that's almost split, straight down the middle, on an 82% turnout. How does Derby Museums kind of respond to both that decision to leave, because that in a city that is quite diverse, that's very diverse, but also that amount of civic engagement, 82% turnout, is incredible. How do you deal with that as a museum?
Well, that amount of civic engagement is brilliant, regardless of the way the vote went. I mean, initially, I mean, the day after the vote, there were some reports of hate crimes in the city, and we, with the cathedrals and faith groups, immediately designated our museum a place of sanctuary so people could come in if they felt unsafe. And I was really impressed to see the picture that you and your staff put on Twitter last week of all your overseas staff, and I think that was a great example the National Gallery showed. So there's an immediate response to this kind of letting out of something that people had, and our job as museums is to try and put this into context, into the long term. And we're quite lucky in the fact that our collections go back hundreds, millions of years, and museums are really well placed to be that kind of bridge between what are sort of cultural gulfs within society. So, crudely, you have kind of liberal cosmopolitans on one side and more sort of authoritarian traditionalists on the other. And although it's a very kind of, as I said, a sort of crude division, it's one that we can see within our community. And our role, I think, is to be that bridge between those sort of competing value systems. And there are all sorts of reasons as to why people voted to leave the EU, and I don't think there's enough research been done on what to try and unpick that. But there was something about people feeling that their world is changing and they have no say, no agency on that changing world. And our role is to try and piece together a narrative to try and understand what change means to society. So regional museums in the UK have collections from all over the world. And we're fairly unique in that. Most of our collections in our cities were gleaned in the 19th century and go back to our colonial past. And I think so go back to my earlier answer about kind of taking the Eve for granted. I think our museums actually became more localised over the last 30 years, especially in the regions. And we a lot about our work with our community, and we an awful lot of locally focused work, and not enough about the wider world. And I think now there's a really good opportunity to place local, national, and global citizenship into context using our collections from around the world. So our latest piece of work is called Your Place in the World, and we're using our World Cultures collection, going out to places in the city where we know there's low engagement with museums, people that have never been to museums before, to try and look at these issues of what it means to live in a local, culturally diverse city, but also putting that in the context of a globalized world. And cultural heritage is the perfect vehicle to do that. So that's what I think. I mean, our museums have really got to double down on trying to understand what global citizenship means.
As someone who's about to take up a role at the Imperial War Museum, I'm really interested in the concept of global citizenship. But also, we haven't become any less. We are still European in the UK. We will just not be a member of the European Union, and that's the kind of historical context. I think is very important. Museums, particularly, I think civic museums. I'll come on to the National Gallery in a second, but there are very, very few places in the city which are genuinely kind of egalitarian, where the whole community can kind of come together. Because historically, maybe that would have been the church, or would have been a place of faith. Do we need to sort of try harder in a way with that, in that community engagement, in that we as museums as a whole tend to work with one group here who may not kind of come into the museum or engage with the museum very regularly, and then we work with another one, and then we work with academia and business, but we do it these kind of little islands, and we need to kind of, the only time we ever bring everybody together is if we've got a blockbuster exhibition that everybody wants to see.
Yeah.
Isn't it better? Otherwise, the only place everywhere people are going to meet is at motorway service stations and things like that.
There are really nice chairs at motorway service stations that can give you massages. So, yeah, no, absolutely. I think we see all over our cities the civic realm being eroded. The number of open spaces available for people to congregate is getting smaller and smaller, and museums are kind of a real bulwark against the erosion of the public realm. So, I would say, if not here, where?
The National Gallery has extremely long-standing, as we said, international partnerships, and particularly European, given the nature of your collection. And when I started to think about the National Gallery, there seems to be almost conflicting identities that the gallery could have. You're based in London, which voted overwhelmingly, it's a very diverse city, voted overwhelmingly to remain. But you are a UK national museum in a country that's a little bit more divided in its opinion. Your collection is European, predominantly European art, not entirely European art. How do you, and your staff are very diverse as well, how do you manage that as a director of that, of a gallery that has that many different sorts of faces, if you like?
Well, here you come across the sort of disjunction between London and the rest of the country, which is sort of, I think, came out rather kind of painfully in the Brexit vote. For me, it was rather a shock, in as much as one of the first things I had to do when I came back from Spain and took up the role at the gallery was to take one of our pictures, a Rembrandt self-portrait, first of all to Belfast, then to Kendal in the Lake District, and finally to Bristol. And particularly those last two places, we sat round with colleagues from there, and you suddenly looked around and you think, actually, a lot of the people in this room are very, very keen on Brexit. And I hadn't realised just how strong that feeling was outside of London. So it was quite a shock to encounter that. And one of the things that you mentioned, you said we're Europeans, but we're not in the EU. That's a very interesting take that it's been kind of possible to take in this country. I'm very interested to hear what Laurie might have to say about this, because I think in other parts of Europe, it's a sort of an opposition that doesn't really arise. You say, I love Europe, but I don't like the EU. Well, the way Europe has developed post-war has been very much in that sense. So the investment that Europeans have made in the idea of the EU is very, very significant. It seemed to me that it was very slightly artificial to make that distinction between being European and being in the EU. Or anyway, it was let's say instrumentalized during the course of the debate. I'm not answering your question. I realise that. I did want to say one other thing, and that is, I thought that our voice was not being heard during the time of the lead up to the referendum. Of course, the cultural area and sort of the museum sector specifically, we are enormously committed. We have a huge amount invested in collaborations, in understanding different peoples, different cultures, in working together. And I'm afraid that we didn't really speak up. We weren't given the opportunity to speak up. The debate, as you all know, focused essentially on economy and immigration. And culture, which is such a founding element of the way Europe has developed post-war, really didn't get much of a look in. So it seems to me that museums have a very important role to kind of reignite that discourse, and the National Gallery certainly has the responsibility, and I think has the sort of presence to be able to help in that debate.
Before I ask Laurie another question, I would like to open this out to the audience. So to avoid that painful silence when I ask if anybody has any questions, so give the period of Laurie's answer to the next one to think of some questions for our panellists. So Laurie, I wrote about 3 years ago, and this touches on a few things that were mentioned in the first session. About 3 years ago, the British Council produced a report called As Others See Us. Now, not something that our audiences, particularly for kind of cultural products, saw the UK. Taking that title, from your experience now of having left living in the UK and moving to Spain, do others see us differently now than they did on the 22nd of June?
So I suppose when this report was made in 2014, there were some feedback saying that UK is seen globally as a very attractive place for trading, as a cultural value. It's got very attractive artistic and cultural services to provide to the world. And to be honest with you, since 1973, that the UK joined the EU, there have always been a vision like UK is still one feet in, 1 feet out. Never been part of the EU currency, never been part of the Schengen zone. So it was not as much as a surprise that maybe the American election result has been at the end of this year. Saying that the cultural and creative sector is the faster growing economy in Europe and in the world. And the UK is one of the leaders of this economy. So I think people realize in Europe that they cannot do anything without the UK, and UK cannot do anything without the EU. So the cooperation will still have to happen because of that, and the positive. There is a sense of solidarity again with towards the UK, and there is a need for people to find new ways of working together, new ways of attracting audiences, and there is still a willingness of cooperation. So I'm not saying that since the 23rd of June there were like massive changes. This could happen because of the funding available, so they need to be smart and clever about the way you continue working together, really.
Yeah. Well, the basis of upon which we all worked hasn't changed. I mean, we're still going to work together on collections and research, and none of that will change. It's the mechanism and the method by which we do it.
I will be just by curiosity interesting to know in the room how many people are European citizens.
Very interesting question. Now, been plenty of time to think of some excellent questions. So, who has a question for our panel? I'm afraid you're going to have to shout as we have a rather limited number of microphones. Lucy, can you? Can you say who you are and where you're from?
I'm Lucy Marber, I'm the Cultural Partnerships Officer of the South East Museum Development Programme. I suppose there's a dilemma in the fact that so many people in the cultural sector know them to have voted Remain. And does that in some way taint museums' credibility in terms of being this place where people can come together?
I was talking to a friend last night that I was doing a session. He said, "Aren't museums in some way at fault?" As his, you could ask that question. It's not the most popular one, but.
Not everyone in museums voted to stay. The day after the vote, we had all the team in front of me, and as I was talking about the seismic shift of the vote, and I kind of thought, actually, you didn't all vote to remain. Yeah, I'm sure there will be members of my team that voted to stay, you have to stop yourself from thinking that isn't the case. And if you go and ask your front of house staff, I bet you there's a sizable minority, if not majority, that voted to leave. So don't assume that everybody voted to stay and everybody is a cosy liberal. I think this. I put some direction towards the work that's going on in Manchester at the moment. So Manchester Museum is working with a guy called Tom Crompton, who runs an organisation called Common Cause, and they work on a framework of values and frames. It's called Values and Frames, and it's based on the Schwartz values model, and it is looking to provide that bridge by understanding the values of those people that voted one way or the other. So it's not based on where they come from politically, and so it's putting all the political baggage away, but thinking of the values that those individuals hold dear. And there are bridging values between, again, it's very crude, cosmopolitans and authoritarians, around issues to do with love and joy and friendship and honesty, that regardless of your political perspective. And it's in that kind of middle ground, I think, that we should be thinking of how we use our organisations to begin to make those conversations and allow those conversations to happen within our institutions. So I think we've got to, it can feel quite hard as a liberal to have to go that way to be that bridge, but we're going to have to. And if you look at, we pride ourselves in the fact that 52% of the population will go to a museum once a year. What about the 48%? We've just had some non-visitor research done in our community that was geared towards clumsily titled low attainment groups, and they make up quite a high proportion of the city, and they're not coming to our museum. And even if the research showed that even if we sold it as a place of fun and entertainment, only 25% would come. It's a really low impact. And people are using leisure time, they're spending money on leisure activities, they're not coming to museums. So we're still preaching to the choir at the moment, and it's a big, big step we have to take to make that bridge. And that's a systemic behavioural change that our organisations are going to have to go through.
I'm going to take a couple of questions at once.
Okay, so I'm going to come out. My name's Wendy Earle, and I'm from Birkbeck University, and I'm speaking entirely of personal capacity here. I thought I might confess that I voted Leave. I'm a liberal, and one of the reasons why I voted Leave was because the EU has been just so awful in relation to migrants, for example, paying Turkey to take them back to live there, and also to Greece. And one of the things that strikes me about the discussion here and elsewhere, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion we've been having here. I think it's very good. One of the things that strikes me is this nostalgia towards the EU that comes out in relation to defending it. I see myself as part of Europe, and I'm not a European citizen, I'm a British citizen, but I like the fact of being close to Europe. only way to conceive of being European. And yet there's been this huge nostalgia towards the EU. So I guess my question would be, what were the negative aspects? Because I know there were some of actually dealing with the EU and EU bureaucracy when we were there. And are there not some benefits to being free of that? Even if those don't vote for another 5 years.
And Judith.
Judith Nesbitt, Director of National International Programmes at Tate. And I really welcome, Gabrielle, what you had to say about the need to mobilise public discussion about what is at stake. I was part of a conference in Berlin recently, organised by British Council, bringing together UK and EU professionals across 3 sectors: arts and culture, education, higher education, and science. And it was really wonderful, actually, to see how much common cause there was across those 3 sectors. And I suppose I'm just making a plea for some joint advocacy across museums and science and education to say what it is that we need to secure from the period of negotiation that is ahead. And that's negotiation, that's advocacy both to the UK government and EU.
It's 2 quite different questions.
I'm sure there's, if you went around the room, there's any number of things that people actually hate about the EU, even though they may have voted to stay, and often, you know, they're completely disconnected. It seems to me. I suppose what the, you know, our time in the EU has made us take for granted, was something that Tony mentioned, take for granted the ease with which we can collaborate with foreign partners, with foreign institutions, and that's something that, you know, potentially we will miss quite seriously. It will become more complicated. I just did want to tell you, I met the Italian cultural minister, Franceschini, a few weeks ago, and I put to him, you know, that there is a concern in this country that particularly European institutions are very tied to their ministries, might find themselves less inclined to collaborate with post-Brexit Britain. Also partly because they're more bound in with their ministry. So there may be kind of political directives from above saying, you know, don't work with the Brits, work with the Greeks, or work with the French. And he responded instantly to this, saying that is absolutely not our point of view. Anyone who even sort of proposes something like that in the ministry will be severely reprimanded by me. So I certainly took some comfort that at least some of our European colleagues are looking actually to maintain and indeed strengthen ties with our institutions in the post-Brexit period.
Were we too nostalgic, or are we too nostalgic?
Well, the positive thing again of maybe leaving the EU would be not having all the administrative burden, because even if people wanted to stay, you have to do that, and some effort has been made, but it still is. So maybe there would be, is a personal view, maybe there would be an opportunity for UK Museum to be more flexible in the way they want to run their project, in the way that they want to collaborate with their partners, and being more independent and doing maybe other kind of collaboration. So that could be a positive aspect of it, I suppose.
Maybe from the point of the museum, I'm just speaking from myself now, that I really feel that this point about nostalgia cuts both ways, and that there is many people who wanted who voted to leave, who have an idea, a nostalgic idea about what it was like before we joined the EU, may or may not relate to reality. Those things are, I mean, we can't really use nostalgia as an argument point. And also that the regulations that we think we're freeing ourselves from must somehow exist, because we're getting out of the European Working Time Directive, but when we get our own working directive, we have, you know, every time we talk about deregulating, somebody at the bottom of the heap suffers, and those are the people who voted to leave. And so when we talk about deregulating, what I think was not understood was not the part that museums play, per se, or the cultural institutions play, but the part that Europe actually played in protecting the people at the bottom of the heap. And that's what wasn't understood, and that's part of why the vote went as it did, in my opinion. So that every bit of regulation that we shelve or we say we don't want anymore, we're going to have to spend our time here recreating it. And in the first instance, the Great Repeal Bill says we take on every bit of that and we examine every bit of that. So we're in this for a very, very long term. It's going to be years and years before we can say to every bit of European regulation, yes, we want it, no, we don't. And that's all got to be debated now, here, whereas those debates have actually been happening over the last 40 years, and we chucked it all on the bin.
I think the one thing we can all agree on is that this is going to take an enormous amount of time. That's realistically 2 years is optimistic.
There was only one thing I wanted to add to that, which was that I don't think any more airtime for the Remain view would have changed the situation, because in my experience in talking with people who voted to leave, reason had very little to do with it. And mostly the problem that I'm not talking about my colleagues here in the room, who I know are very reasonable people, and we do reason together. But many of the people who voted at a visceral level to leave the EU saw people like me who could reason their way into the EU as part of the problem. We're part of a metropolitan elite, and all you had to do was begin to reason to be dismissed as something that was the problem.
I think it's a really interesting perspective, and you mentioned nostalgia, for museums to particularly address the politics of nostalgia, and how we do programming in that respect, but also, as Tony said, about this feeling of not being part of the world's changing and people not feeling part of it, and maybe that's particularly when museums, and coming from a collection at the Imperial War Museum, which shows the cause and consequence of that not taking place, I think is a really important perspective. I'm going to take, I've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to take any more questions and some from the panel. Yes,
my name's Adriana Brunet. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm just about to launch a civic engagement platform connecting museums to wider audiences. And I'm particularly interested to know from the panel, we've spoken a lot about the debate from the point of view of museums and curators. I'd like to know, is there an opportunity, Tony, you touched on it, an opportunity perhaps to leverage more of a civic engagement and civic participation, not just in supporting museums, especially local museums who might start struggling and feeling the effects of funds being cut, but also an opportunity to develop this notion of the global citizen, global versus local, the need to support your local community, your local museum, but also an opportunity maybe through digital resources like my platform or any other platform out there to bring these stakeholders together without borders, because after all, we're talking digital now. You don't have physical borders. It's much more approachable. So, what would you think should be the way forward to enhance global citizenship in audiences?
Well, I think you've just answered the question to a degree, in that if we think without borders, and the digital realm obviously offers those sorts of opportunities. I think there's a sort of paradox between wanting to put up borders, which by its nature the Leave vote gave, to the need to tear them down. So, and I think sometimes we struggle with, so as I said, people vote to leave for a whole range of reasons. They were the Little Englanders, but they're also internationalists that saw the EU as a nightmare bureaucracy. So harnessing those sorts of those sorts of things, I think, again, is a challenge if we're in a kind of pattern of behaviour that's used to working with the institutions and with the other kind of funding institutions that we have. So I think there is a call to renew the civic institutions, and we need to get our public to fall back in love with institutions, because institutions have been kind of really bad-mouthed over the last 20 years. But we're living in a kind of world of fake news and post-truth stuff. And consistently, museums are seen as places that the public trust. So, and they're often anchor organisations within that broader civic realm. So, in order for them to kind of realise that role, they need to understand how civil society works more, and distinguish between civic institutions and civil society, which are two completely different things, but are often interchangeable. So that's making sure we get out and understand how our communities work, how all these bodies out with the political realm interact with each other, how neighbourhoods work, how communities work, the fact that people disagree, agree, are indifferent to each other, rather than existing in this sort of very niche, nicely categorised world that you talked about has been our the way of working previously. So a much more sort of granular approach to community, I think we're going to need, and we're going to need people like you and community activists to help organisations change their kind of behavioural norms. So yeah, can we talk afterwards?
Tony, by way of draw this to a close, because lunch has been delivered. The conference has always been about building international partnerships. And if we're talking about global citizenship, we're talking about understanding our communities a bit more, we surely have to place it in the context of the world. Therefore, that is incumbent on all of us to develop those international partnerships, both within and outside of Europe. Because, as you said, museums are trusted institutions, and there's an increasingly small list of public institutions that are trusted, and we're still there. So how, by way of summing up, how do we need to reconsider now our international partnerships? Start with Tony.
Well, we have to look further than Europe. I mean, working with Europe was easy. I mean, we used to joke about how awful it was to fill in ESF forms, but that was the kind of least of our worries. And so finding partners in Europe was much easier than, say, working with partners in India or China. But if you look at the community of Derby, the majority of people in our minority people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups come from India and Pakistan, and we need to engage with those countries as much as we do with Europe now. So we're working alongside two Indian and Pakistani cultural groups within the city, one in music and one in the visual arts, and they're helping us make links with universities in India. And that's work that we should be doing, but it was easier to work with Europe. So, I wish we weren't leaving the EU, but there is now a chance for us to kind of refocus our minds on what globalism actually means.
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking more recently at extending our remit and our range. We're a gallery of European art, but it's perfectly clear that we can look beyond Europe. And we've currently got an exhibition on, for example, of Australian Impressionism. Well, that took us into a whole new set of relationships and working relationships, which I think will be valuable into the future. So there are certainly situations one can take advantage of. But I do insist that I think it's terribly important that we don't lose any of the sort of good, fruitful working relationships. I mean, a lot of our museums are about memory, about where we are in the world, where we are geographically, where we're culturally, where we're in religious terms. And I think our museums should seek to cling to all those networks and connections and friendships that enable us to think on what are the bigger questions about who we are in a rapidly changing and increasingly globalized society. Just one last thing. Of course, museums didn't vote in the Brexit vote. It was people that voted. And I think that's very it's an obvious but very significant distinction to make, because our museums are trusted institutions. They're not just collections, they are places. They're places where people gather, they're places from which things emanate, and they emanate worldwide now with digital. So we're in a different situation that we were, some decades ago. Our reach is much larger, and our commitment to local community, I think, is much more clearly focused and defined. There's a huge amount to do, but it's much more clearly defined. So we've got the global reach, but we've also got the local responsibility.
So, as an EU citizen, as an EU expert, I still believe in EU values. So I just wanted again to encourage you to apply for EU funding, because it's still available there, and you've got, as Gabrielle said as well, need to work with the key partners you already gone and looking at the opportunities to develop together. I was personally affected by the referendum, which was, a vote as part of the of UK citizen. I couldn't made anything about it, but it's kind of looking as well as it is now, and the Brexit is going to happen, which is something we are sure about, and we need to move things forward really, and looking at the opportunity around there. Something you might be interesting as well. We were talking about other way of collaboration, and one of the opportunity I took for being in Spain was to collaborate with another organization there and develop an e-platform to develop to help cultural and creative sector to develop European projects. So if you are interested in it, just come to speak with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all your very perceptive points and questions as well. But can you join me in thanking Tony, Gabrielle? I have one very strict instruction that I have been given to tell you, and that is the conference will start again at precisely 1:30 back in here. So, and you're all, please don't bring your drinks back into here, but please go in and enjoy your lunch.